Rime of the Frostmaiden, a campaign review. This campaign takes place in Icewind Dale, the setting of, well, many famous fantasy novels involving drits and other such things and individuals, as well as several video games such as the two Icewind Dale video games that came out in the early 2000s. Now, this campaign gets player characters from level 1 up to around level 10. Overall, it's split up into 7 chapters, which the first 2 of which, for the most part, explore the 10 towns of Icewind Dale and the surrounding area. Now, I won't go into detail of every little mini adventure and segment here. I will kind of touch on them. But the first 10 adventures, plus 2 mini adventures that can be brought in as well, explore locations that are near each one of these 10 towns, some of which are just a little encounter. For example, the adventure taking place near Bremen, it deals with a plesiosaur in the Mare Doldrin. The more interesting one I thought was Caer Dineville, which literally deals with the old castle and some cultists in the castle. Caer Koenig deals with climbing Kelvin's Cairn, and there's some other adventures that are just cave adventures. Some are better than others. Most are sort of so-so for the most part, but it gives the player characters a chance to explore the 10 towns themselves, interact with the people, and get to know the area during a terrible period of time, as at this time, Auril the Frostmaiden is repeatedly casting a darkness effect that affects the entire region of Icewind Dale, cloaking it in eternal darkness effectively every night, thus freezing it and making the people suffer, something Auril prefers. Now, as the player characters go through the first 10 chapters, plus the 2 extras, they'll slowly level up. They'll probably get to level 2 or 3 by the last chapter, and they'll have gotten a good idea of what's happening around the area and the general plots, comings and goings. Each town is pretty close to each other, within an hour or 2 of travel, so there's not going to be too many random encounters in the wilderness. There might be 1 or 2 here and there. Eventually, you hit chapter 2, which is very similar to chapter 1, only the player characters are going to go out further into the wilderness. They're never going to do like a full. It might take the player characters, if they're in Targos and they're going to Cave of the Berserkers, that might take the better part of a day to get out there, versus going from Targos to Goodmead is only a few hours. But these different chapter 2 chapters and locations are all very individual. They're all very different. Many of them are little cave adventures as well, like Crackling Chasm, the Cave of the Berserkers. But there are some standouts, particularly the Jarlmut. It's a series of giant thrones where the ghosts of frost giants appear. There's a little dungeon crawl connecting to it. It's very small. It's a decent little adventure. Dark Goddess, or the Dark Duchess, I should say, is a wrecked ship that is wrecked in the snow and the icebergs. That's fun to explore. It deals with an ancient white dragon who's now blind, but can see via blind sight. Antijuke's Bell is a mini adventure dealing with a awakened sperm whale, which later can take the player characters into chapter 5, which was called Auril's Abode. Some of the bigger standouts, though, are the Black Cabin, which is a fun, really small adventure dealing with an arcane device that may have exploded or may still explode, and a number of weird events that can happen at the Black Cabin. It's really kind of event-based, but just unique as an adventure, and one of the strong standouts. One of the other ones I really enjoyed is I wanted to go back, and the Lonely Wood Adventures from Chapter 1 deals with an elven tomb, which is one of the better adventures in the entirety of Chapter 1, and it's just unique. It's out on the surface. It deals with some just unique creatures a little bit, and it's a fun adventure. The Lost Spire of Netheril is one of the better ones as well. In Chapter 2, it deals with a tower that is broken off from Yithrin, which is a ruined city from Netheril that's crashed under the Great Glacier. And the tower is literally upside down, and there's some very fun, interesting things there. And one of the other ones is It Ascendant, the crashed Nautiloid. It's essentially a mind flayer flying ship, which is wrecked out in the snow in the mountain ranges of the Spine of the World. and deals with some gnomish serenomorphs, essentially gnomish mind flayers. There's a lot of other adventures in this particular chapter. Some are better than others, again, and it will take the player characters away from the Icewind Dale itself, but they vary in quality. Chapter 3, however, deals with Sunblight, which is a 3-level dungeon crawl that the Dwergar have built. The Dwergar are building a mechanical dragon out of a substance called Chardelin, and then planning to set it loose on the 10 towns to destroy the 10 towns and take over the area, as they love the darkness of Icewind Dale, because they're underdark creatures and they're vaguely evil, of course. Now, when the player characters get there, and I'll show you a little bit of that chapter here, just going to 5e tools. There's the entrance of Sunblight. It's a fortress, the outside entrance, I should say. As you go in, you can kind of see the interior a little bit. I'll just kind of touch on it. You start on the second level. You get some of these living chambers. You get the control area up here with all these gears. This leads to a pair of doors that open up top. And when the player characters arrive, you can see the doors right here, by the way. When the player characters arrive at this location, the Charterland Dragon will be released and will fly off to the north towards Icewind Dale. And the player characters will be faced with a dilemma. Do they want to continue up to Sunblight itself and deal with what's happening here from what they've heard, or do they want to chase down the dragon before something terrible happens to Icewind Dale itself? It really is a dilemma. Player characters in my group, for example, they just decided to check out Sunblight, explored it. There's a huge number of Dwergar in the downstairs and other creatures. There's a forge here. There's information of what the player characters are facing, the dragon that is. And the dragon is a creature that's unique and tailored for their particular level, roughly level 4 or 5, as a sort of a lesser mechanical dragon. But the player characters will realize the danger that Icewind Dale faces as they do Sunblight, unless they choose to head back immediately, and thus do Chapter 4 of Rime of the Frostmaiden right away, and then go back to Sunblight later. Now, overall, Sunblight's a good adventure. It'll take you about 3 to 5 sessions to run it, if your sessions are about 4 hours. And it's probably a little better than the overall Chapter 1 and 2 adventures, just because it's more centrally themed, and it's the first time the player's characters are doing an adventure that's much longer. You can maybe compare it to the Castle of Caer Dineval a little bit, which is one of the longer Chapter 1 adventures, but it is the first major dungeon crawl in this particular campaign, and it has a major part of the plot of the story. Now, as you get to Chapter 4, you're going to go into the event-based part of the adventure where the Charterland Dragon has been released. Here is the Charterland Dragon blasting the 10 towns with a ray of radiance and just destroying things in one of the 10 towns. Zardark Sunblight here's his stats for the Dwergar leader who is behind all this. As you go into the area, you get the how the dragon goes, flight path. You actually get a whole map here from the dragon's path as it goes to each town, making its attacks, and finally comes back to Sunblight. I'll note it does take time to hit each town, and it's slowed down several times. If the player characters happen to go back to the towns, they might have to deal with, say, some invisible Dwergar who are causing problems and making things worse, or looters, or other such things as they're in this particular adventure. And eventually, though, the player character will likely have a showdown with the Charterland Dragon itself and have to destroy it. Otherwise, it'll just go back to Sunlight and possibly be repaired and set loose again. Now, the player characters, of course, could just let it destroy everything and say, the hell with the Dale, we don't need this, or something like that. That just depends on your group. There's some of those random things that can happen in the towns, by the way. But that's, of course, not something that probably should happen in your campaign, but you never know what player characters will do. The player characters in general are going to find that the plot armor of Icewind Dale in this chapter is going to be thrown out the window. Most of the buildings, many of the towns are completely destroyed. Dugan's Hole, for example, and Goodmead are leveled. East Haven, I think, is half destroyed. Targos is badly damaged. And what is it? Tourmaline suffers severe damage to overall, and I think Lonelywood is completely annihilated. but the player characters might be able to stop some of this destruction based on their decisions, such as when they go back, what path they take, what resources they have. It's really a strong event-based chapter, and it takes place within a day or so of time. And if the player characters don't act quickly, things will get really, really bad for the Icewind Dale very, very quickly, and they'll come back to utter destruction. And it could lead to the end of the campaign, or perhaps just a well, Icewind Dale might just be a ruin where there's Dwergar running amok, and most of the humans are dead, and towns are destroyed, and there's more post-apocalyptic all of a sudden than it was already. Now, overall, Destruction's Light is one of the best parts of this entire campaign. I highly recommend when you get to this particular chapter, enjoy it while it lasts, because it's really a well thought out chapter in general. But eventually, you're going to get to chapter 5. This is where the player characters will have their initial confrontation with Auril. I say initial because they might actually face Auril again. The player characters will hear about a device called the Codicil of White. It's a book of ancient lore that one of the Arcane Brotherhood members, Valen Harpel, is seeking in order to access the Caves of Hunger and thus the ruined Netherese city of Yithrin out under the Great Glacier. Now, it's hidden inside, well, this fortress, Castle Grimscale, which may look pretty familiar to some players and people, as it harkens back to some other franchise. But they'll find that they'll arrive at an island called Solstice. Solstice. This is the map right here of it, and it is a giant snowflake island. It is crafted by ancient frost giant magic. There's still like one or two frost giants remaining, or at least the skeletons of them, and one blind ancient frost giant in Grimskull. There's all these ruined boats around it the player characters could explore. There's a few loose locations, like some locations where there's these frozen carvings that Auril has made, and I think there's a Remorhaz in here somewhere. The player characters don't have to explore all the locations. Inevitably, they'll go to the center and they'll deal with Grimscale itself, and then they'll face Auril at some point. I'll put it that way. As we're kind of going in here, and I won't look into every detail, here's those ice structures and all that. As you go to the end of this particular chapter, or the meat and potatoes of it, here's the front view of Grimscale. This is the entrance. Here is the ground floor where they explore the sort of living chambers. There's a stairway going down to the subterranean area, which again is snowflake themed. Chapter 2, or palace level, I should say, is where they likely encounter Auril at some point, and then the summit is where her rock, which is how she gets up in the air to cast her everlasting rhyme and turn the Icewind Dale into a land of darkness, where it has its nest. If the player characters kill the rock or drive Auril out of Grimscale, she's likely not able to recast her spell any longer, and they would have stopped the everlasting rhyme, at least for the time being. Now, I would recommend, a lot of DMs agree, that Auril, who will have 3 different forms. The first one is a snowy owlbear, the second one is an icy woman, and this third one is a sort of shard of ice. That once her first form is defeated, and perhaps if she's feeling overwhelmed during her second form, that Auril should use some method to escape from Grimscale and flee to the east to try to make it one way or another, perhaps through some secret means, to Yithrin, thus giving the player characters more reason to go to Yithrin. Yithrin in the later chapters really doesn't have that much to do with the Frostmaiden herself. It has more to do with the Arcane Brotherhood, which might seem a bit odd structurally speaking. It might remind you a little bit of the ending of Game of Thrones, where the Night King is defeated, and then later you have to deal with Cersei, which is odd structurally speaking for a story and all that, when the villain seems to be Auril. This is what I would suggest, is that she has some means of escape, maybe a ring of teleportation or something like that, and gets away before they can finally defeat her. But they will have to get the Codicil of White still, and they will have stopped the everlasting rhyme for now. The Codicil is in the basement. They'll have to go through these 4 different tests, through 4 different doors to access it, and each test will literally teleport the player characters out into the middle of the wilderness, and For example, it might just be some random location up here or just anywhere. Well, they'll encounter some of the nomadic barbarians of different tribes that are out there in the wilderness and events that are happening to those tribes. Each one of these tests has to do with some factor that a real value, such as perseverance or cruelty. And depending on how the player characters pass the test, it'll possibly give them access to the inner doors where the console is kept. Now, if the player characters fail the test, they can't access the inner doors. There are other means of accessing them, which might involve some frost druids, or it may just involve the destruction of Grimshell itself. Nonetheless, in the end, the player character will likely get the codicil, and Auril will be defeated or possibly driven off. Which brings us to Chapter 6, the Caves of Hunger. Now, looking at Chapter 6, the player characters are they most likely would have been hired by Valen Harpel or would have some other reason to want to go there. They might just want to go there so they can go to Yithrin because it's a huge adventure location. It's a ruined Netherese city filled with wonders and magic. Here's the entrance, the fissure at the Regig Glacier, I should say. As the player characters are coming here, they need the Codicil of Light to be able to speak the rime of the Frostmaiden. It's literally a poem that can magically open the fissure. And as we look here, this is the Caves of Hunger themselves. They start in the northwest corner, and the player characters can meander about. There are a couple of different paths. There's lots of sort of hunger-themed things here, like a gnoll vampire and some strange magical effects. Ruined bits of Netheril. I think there's some Remorhazes here as well, and some drow show up. There's these orchards here with strange fruit, which could help the player characters. There's an eldritch horror thing here, and a lot of interesting locations and fun little items and creatures the player characters could encounter. And eventually the player characters will get to H39 and basically pass this area by and eventually make their way to Yithrin itself. I'll note, if you look on the map, and I noted this in my review of Chapter 6 individually, the area of Chapter 6 is very small. There must be an extended tunnel that just makes its way to Yithrin that goes for several miles, but then it doesn't really explore that. The player characters just have to beat the caves themselves to get further in. The DM could add some additional locations along the way, perhaps, or maybe some side tunnels, make it a little more interesting if you want. But chapter 6 is a good dungeon crawl as it allows some interesting choices and direction. My player characters just almost did a straight shoot and didn't really explore all the back chambers, and honestly missed a lot of different things in this particular chapter as we were near the end of our campaign in general. One way or another, the player characters will make it their way through, most likely, unless they die here, of course, and they'll move on to Chapter 7, which is the finale of this campaign, which is the Doom of Yithrin, which I will say is one of the best chapters of the campaign. It's very different from, say, Chapter 4. It's kind of similar a little bit to Chapter 5 in that it involves exploring a location, but it's different in its setup. Also, here's some Nothics who are doing fun, dark things. Now, here is the ruined city itself. Let's go here. There we are. It's situated at an angle, but due to magic, the player characters aren't affected by that in any meaningful way. There's some lingering magic going on here in this ruin. Some of the ruins are still buried in snow and frost and are inaccessible. One of the towers here, probably one of the ones that's buried here and you can't see, is broken off, and that's one of the adventures the player characters encounter in Chapter 2, because that tower is lodged in the snow upside down. The player characters go from here across this little tongue of ice and can then begin exploring the actual ruins. And of course, here's the Mythalar that allows the city to fly, theoretically, and many magical effects to work. There's the central tower, which is very interesting. This is the way up to it. In my campaign, we had to cut things a little short because we were running out of time and we didn't have a full group anymore. So there's a wall of force right here at Y6. This is not something you can easily dispel, but in my campaign, I allowed it to work because we didn't have a lot of time. but it allows the player characters to access the fortress in the center and deal with perhaps the main threat of what's going here on here in Yithrin, which in this case is a Demi-Lich, who is the real final boss in the Rime of the Frostmaiden, which again seems kind of odd. If you had a real escape and is now lingering here in Yithrin, perhaps instead of the Demi-Lich, they encounter her, or perhaps they encounter both of them. It could be a big plot twist. There are, of course, a lot of interesting locations the player characters could go to, different arcane towers, one for every school of magic, as well as a stadium. It's a little weird game that player characters can play. It's not the only game, little side mini game the player characters could play in this campaign, by the way. There's another one with the Goliath clans. There's a bunch of different locations, the little gardens and all that, and that a library in here somewhere. But the main plot of this chapter is the player character should have to go to each location to get clues to be able to open past the wall of force, unless they have the means to do so at Y6 to access the main tower and conclude the adventure, which will well they'll deal with the Demi-Lich. Now the cool thing about this camp with this chapter is there's a lot of fun creatures that have been brought back, such as tomb tappers. There's some living Bigby's hand spells, spitting mimics, the Demos and other Galvin Magans from first edition have been brought back, and they're like almost like mannequin people that are like fake people that live in the city and just are still lingering on. Some Nothics. There's some unique creatures here. There's a living demi-plane creature that's kind of feeble that they could encounter and interact with. A lot of interesting spell effects. You can see that there's a night hag and she's doing some dark business here. As you go through it, here's a Kingsport, a awakened penguin, I believe. There's some interesting locations the player characters can visit. Here's a green Slade who is doing some very interesting things at a telescope and plotting and scheming. But as they go through, eventually they go to this finale, or essentially the main tower. When the player characters first come to the first floor, they can explore these rooms. There's a gulf they can pass to get to this star-shaped area, which let's just say is interesting. They go to the second floor. There's some these doors all open up to this starry area with these thrones where there's this weird magic taking place. And if they go through the wrong doors, it summons devils to attack them. Eventually, the player characters will have the finale with the Demi-Lich in this top area, but it also deals with some other creatures that are in the area. I won't go into every detail about what happens here, but you do get some fun stuff like this helmed horror with a brain in the jar mounted on top of him, which is a fun, interesting idea. These fantastic living blades of disaster, which are just contract swords that are just going to destroy the party if they don't take it seriously. They are very, very dangerous enemies and a really unique threat to find here. And there's other such things. You also find this particular object, the stone spindle, an artifact from an ancient time that the city recovered, which caused the city's mythology to malfunction and caused the city to crash to begin with. This could lead to many, many interesting things happening as a finale and a conclusion to the campaign. Because after they defeat the Demi-Lich and they explore the ruined city, two possibilities, amongst others, remain. One, that the entire city, or perhaps the players, maybe the entire world, depending on the DM, could be thrown back in time to the time of ancient Netherwell, which could lead to an expanded higher level campaign of what happened when the city was intact, floating around. Or it could lead to the player characters getting a scroll that summons the Tarask, and what happens when the Tarask is summoned, or perhaps when a villain like Balin Harpel, who's desperate, summons the Tarask. Here's the Tarask scroll of the scroll of Tarask summoning. And what happens after all this takes place? And the campaign does kind of set up some possibilities of where things could go as a follow-up, but stuff that doesn't have to happen. Again, with my campaign, we ended kind of early. They defeated the Demi-Lich, and then they sort of just teleported out of Icewind Dale, and the campaign eventually concluded. But once the player characters have completed the campaign, they have saved Icewind Dale, they have explored Yithrin, they have probably had a great time, because overall, it's a fairly good campaign. Overall, it has kind of a loose beginning as a campaign, a solid center, especially with chapters 4 and 5, and a fairly good ending with a lot of exploration that can happen in Yithrin. It just kind of has an odd structure overall, the way it's set up, and some player characters might be DMs might get a little bored with the numerous cave adventures early in the campaign and how loose the early campaign might feel. Now, plus the structure of the real dying in chapter 5 potentially, which is again odd. And again, in my campaign, my player characters literally thought the campaign was over until I had to explain to them that it wasn't. There's still more things to do. Overall, I would rate Rime of the Frostmaiden as a campaign as a 4.25 or a 4.25 out of 5 stars. It's a very good campaign. It's not perfect, but it's definitely worth playing. It'll get your player characters roughly to level 10, and if you add some other stuff in, like side adventures, or you want to tie it into the Icewind Dale video games, then you can probably get to higher level. You could continue the campaign again at even higher level beyond Yithrin, dealing with the Tarask or dealing with Yithrin in its heyday in the time traveling situation. It can go many places. Now, guys, if you like this review and you would like to see more of these videos, please like and subscribe. And feel free to check out the individual chapters for this campaign as well, such as Chapter 6, Caves of Hunger, the Chapter 1 that deals with the 10 towns, whichever ones you'd like to check out or watch them all in order. It's up to you.